Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this episode, we're talking about what needs to happen below the corps level in land warfare, with Colonel Ethan Diven now serving as Provost at the US Army University. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fire's response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation.
Now, we've done a couple of shows over the past 12 months that looked at the core level of command, specifically the Ukrainian rediscovery of the core level, and also what land command at that level might look like for Western militaries using the experience of the Chief of Staff at HQ ARC as a guide. And in those discussions, we've talked a bit about the role of the Corps in setting the conditions for divisions to win. But modern divisions don't fight like those in World War II, I don't think, nor do they work as we planned to do during the Cold War, perhaps not even in the same way as they did during Afghanistan and Iraq. For all the talk about Brigade Combat Teams, BCTs in the US Army, and those equivalents elsewhere in Western militaries, I'm not sure how I understand how divisions and below will work in contemporary combat. Fortunately for me, the excellent Nate Jennings saw my dilemma and put me in touch with my guest today to walk me through some of the challenges being faced on today's battlefields by brigades and divisions, with an idea of how the US and perhaps their allies might develop their CONOPS at this level for the future. Colonel Ethan Diven is the current Provost of the US Army University. More on that later, perhaps. Having trained and qualified as an armour specialist, he served in Al-Anbar and Baghdad back in the day, and a stint in Afghanistan with the 101st. Ethan was the Chief Live Fires Officer at the Joint Readiness Training Centre and served at the Joint Enabling Capability Command, where he deployed to both Somalia and Afghanistan again. He commanded the 2nd Brigade, 3ID, and the US Ops groups at the US National Training Centre. And now Ethan is dual-hatted as the Commandant of the CGSC and as Provost of the US Army University, where he has an obligation to apply the lessons of his experience to modernise military education in the US Army. Now, that's pretty heady. But the views that Colonel Diven shares with us today will be his own. They don't represent the views or policy of the US Army, the US Army University, or the US Department of War. Ethan, listen, after that long rambling intro, welcome to the show. I think we all need to start from a common baseline. So can I start by asking you what you think has changed in modern warfare? The big muscle movements, if you like, that make changes from our historic approaches to war below the core level necessary.
A really good question, Peter. And thank you for the intro. Thank you for the opportunity. Really excited to talk about warfighting that I've had the pleasure of really being a part of, a student of for the last 25 years. And as you mentioned, started in a brigade focusing on large-scale combat operations as a junior company grade officer, serving through the global war on terror, where we're executing in a very different way. And then most recently, as we transition our doctrine to large-scale combat operations, again, as a brigade commander at an NTC. The problems that Ethan Diven projects onto the current operating environment from my observations at the National Training Center forward in support of Operation Atlantic Resolve, serving alongside allies and partners in Europe for 9 months, are the role of the commander and the tools that enable he or she to better command and control. How we execute the science and how that is still informed by mastery of the art. What do I mean by that? There's a lot of technology, and we are observing the way our adversaries are employing it, which is changing, we'll say, the character of war. But if you don't practice and think about how you're going to integrate that new technology, you're still going to struggle with the same problems of where is my command post? How big is it? Where does the commander need to be? And how do I leverage technology to accelerate the planning process and get those orders and instructions down to the lowest level? The elements of operational art, Army doctrine, joint doctrine that we share with our partners, the increased responsibility for a division to be very specific in their language, how they direct the brigades to plan, prepare, and execute. Specifically, the conditions required, being very precise with expected tempo, providing very direct battlefield framework guidance, because the Army has gone through Army structured changes that has changed striker brigades and infantry brigade combat teams, specifically with intelligence, fires, and engineer capability. That's starting to make its way into armored brigade combat teams, all for the right reasons, centralizing some of that capability up at the principal tactical warfighting echelon for Army doctrine, which is the division. But that also increases the division's responsibility, in my opinion, to be more direct, to make decisions for weighting, for focusing, where, when, and why, and put the brigades in a position to dominate in the close fight. There's a very long answer, but I'll pause there if you've got any comebacks based on that.
Yeah, right. So there's 4 bits there that I really want to pick apart. Overall, it feels like what you're saying is a lot of this is about essentially faster combined arms. But I know that's not what you feel, right? So there is a whole part of this, the obsession with drones, the technology plays a part of it, the air defense element, the whole air environment, the integration of space, the electromagnetic spectrum, which has come back into focus, which probably you and I at the start of our careers were well aware of. This is not just about faster combined arms, right? Or is it?
No, maneuver warfare still is at the core of what we are trying to do, but we need to maneuver the network, because a division and a corps has to be aware it's going to be a contested environment, provide guidance for positioning of capabilities to extend the network to ensure we've got operational reach and endurance from the corps down through, the company level. How are we putting that base maneuver element, it's a company, a battery, or a troop, in a position to succeed at its basic tactical level task? The extended lines of communication from port to flot. We know that those need to be protected, they need to be varied, and they're going to be contested. And so understanding how we want to control the tempo of sustainment that enables the convergence of capabilities inside the core and below. And so we also have to be precise with the threat vulnerabilities, what we need to protect. We know the enemy is hunting our command posts. We know the enemy is hunting our fires capability. And we know the enemy is hunting our ability to extend the network and the protective umbrella, not just air defense artillery or engineer capabilities, but electronic warfare as well. A more holistic, honest assessment and directive approach to where capabilities need to be over time. And so when we say combining arms, it is not the traditional infantry, armor, and fires. It is enabled by a more precise understanding and shaping of the environment when it comes to things that electronic magnetic spectrum management, how big of a signature are we willing to make for how long? Because that presents a signature and a threat. The role of deception, historically, we may not have thought about it until we're talking division and above operations. I would say a brigade has a responsibility to emplace things that may emanate a signature and force the adversary to think twice before they strike. Commit reconnaissance and collection capabilities in an area that we don't have a preponderance of forces. That is a much more deliberate conversation that should turn into action, also part of combining arms.
And it feels like it really resonates with, what we're seeing on various battlefields today in terms of the adversary using deception and camouflage and concealment. Whether it's the Houthis or Hamas or the IRGC, these guys are masters of those kinds of facets well below the brigade level, right? I mean, it's at the micro tactical level. Is this the kind of guidance that you see, this battlefield framework guidance, this, I'm presuming it's a document you talked about, in your first time. Is that what sort of ties all this together?
That is part of it. And that's a really great question. There are baseline fundamentals that our soldiers are taught by sergeants, that are enforced by more senior non-commissioned officers, specified guidance by commanders that communicate the threat. You mentioned camouflage. It's not just putting face paint on or making sure your camouflage netting is up. It is understanding your signature and dispersing yourself that enables camouflage. It's a much more holistic appreciation and deliberate effort to make sure you are small and harder to find, whether it's hiding in the environment, urban camouflage, hiding in plain sight through the electromagnetic signatures you're creating. But that is a part of the framework that is directed by the division and the corps, or the joint forces commander, describing where the forward boundary of a specific commander is and what you are going to do to give them capabilities to protect themselves. The guidance to not go further than here because of, that is your forward boundary. Tying when you're authorized to move across a control measure, employ all domain fires across a control measure because it is part of the tempo the corps and above is expecting you to execute. And so your question was, what about the framework enables protection and camouflage? The framework prescriptively enables tempo, but also drives the disposition of forces that enables deception, decentralization, and localized camouflage, ultimately protecting and enabling endurance of the formation, in my observations and opinions.
So we've got those, and we got that deception, and that was great. We talked about battlefield framework guidance. The other thing, and I'm still on your first question, right, is you talked about the increased responsibilities of divisions, and I'm guessing below that. What did you mean by that? What's the increase? Is it in scope? Is it in scale? What's that involve?
Based on our doctrine evolving and identifying the division as the principal tactical warfighting echelon, we deliberately made some changes to the structure and the forces inside our brigade combat teams. Military intelligence companies have changed. The field artillery battalions, their relationship is no longer assigned to the BCT, but is now underneath the Divisional Artillery Brigade. And the former brigade engineer battalions that provided mobility, countermobility, and survivability, the tactical breaching and obstacle reduction capability, all those have moved up to the division level. And so when a division is expecting a brigade to attack to a certain area and there's an obstacle, a gap crossing, something that needs to be reduced, and we need to combine arms by understanding the enemy, the terrain, and then conduct all domain fires, those things that a BCT formerly did for themselves now have to be done at the division level. And a division has to do that across its multiple subordinate brigades. So using the elements of operational art, identifying where they want to focus in time and place, saying who is the main effort, supporting effort, and apportioning or weighting those subordinates accordingly, there's a larger requirement. It has always been there, but with recent structure changes, it is more of a division expectation and becoming very precise and directed in that language. In my opinion, based on observations as a brigade commander executing in Europe, at home station at Fort Stewart, and my experience at the National Training Center, talking in terms of the minimum force required for specific movement and maneuver forces, conditions enabled by fires, and endurance provided by sustainment is a great conversation for commanders to have as part of their commander's dialogue. And they can turn into an agreement over time that enables tempo. And that's what I would say is an increased division level responsibility to drive that conversation, leading to the orders and instructions that enable tempo and us to combine arms inside the division's close fight, which is where the brigades are fighting.
So, Ethan, from a lot of what you said, it feels like that many of the responsibilities that traditionally at a lower level have been elevated up, right, to the divisional level, centralized so they're better coordinated. We have this problem with signatures, with C2, and the usual delegation of these tasks when there is a contested environment in which communication is not easy. I mean, the Ukrainians have seen that. We've seen that in the Congo. We've seen it in Sudan, that, delegation down is becoming more difficult. And you're also doing some of this stuff on almost guesswork, right, at the divisional level, because you don't know what's happening in divisions and BCTs and at the company level. So you're just sort of imagining what could happen and hoping people are following the plan. This is a problem, isn't it? Because where we have problems with signatures and with contested connectivity, live, real-time, JChat that we've been used to in Western militaries, it is not necessarily a given. And so how's it going to work where we've got this centralization of some of this stuff at the divisional level for all the right reasons? How is that going to get coordinated in this sort of more dynamic way of managing the battle space than we've been used to in a contested environment?
That's a really good question. As I continue to kind of push responsibilities, above the brigade level up to the division, I think no one's going to have a better sight picture of the threat vulnerability and providing an assessment of if command posts are being hunted than division and above, with space-based capabilities, knowing what the enemy is hunting for, and giving that guidance down to the brigade and below. Our brigades and battalions have to train a baseline staff process fundamentals together in person and be good at that before they can start to disaggregate and operate decentralized. And I think that is something I've observed in training that leaders struggle with, is we immediately want to decentralize ourselves, knowing that the enemy is hunting us, but it degrades our ability to drive the military decision-making process, a commander to give good guidance and truly drive it and do their job. And it is incredibly important to understand not just your visual signature of all the expando vans, all the tents, all the vehicles that are required to enable the special sauce of a staff coming together to rapidly turn those products and orders. But at some point, it's the electromagnetic spectrum that it creates. And I'll just call them the network pipes that are required to send those products out to the subordinates that are closer to the flot. And how big something is, the network is truly becoming a commodity that we have to understand and manage, and truly apportion to staff sections so their products can only be so large, measured in kilobytes, delivered over a lower tactical internet or an upper tactical internet capability. And that also has to be directed at a higher level, because brigades don't have the ability to look at themselves and make the determination, am I being hunted on this particular enclave of the network? That's something a division and above, even the combatant or the theater commander, has to direct and say, there's the very prescriptive primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency ways we are passing voice and data. Because again, brigades don't have the experts nor the literal intellectual bandwidth to do that assessment for themselves.
And it's not, we talked a lot about the flot and the problem from getting from division down through brigade to the flot. But the areas of contested C2 also work backwards now, right? I mean, you must have seen this when you were at Joint Enabling Capabilities Command. Is actually the chain goes back, the contestation goes also backwards through the line, right through the supply type, whether it's the A pod, the S pod, where your stuff is coming from, right the way back to the continent where you're supplying from, the home base. The disruption is now, it can be localized, but it can hit those as opposed to the front line in a very disaggregated temporal way that we've not been expecting for a while, right?
Oh, I agree. At the tactical level, so drones and small things that fly through the air, we are focusing an awful lot on what they are delivering and the sense and the strike, first-person viewers, etc. But things that fly through the air also have the potential to help us extend the network through multiple enclaves as well. It's not just terrestrial or ground-based things, the mesh network that potentially can be created, but those long-range unmanned vehicles can help us extend the network as well. Now, the flot is where we focus, but it is an echelonment of capability and maybe a change of how information is being transmitted as you get from the rear area to where we're actually fighting, to all of the, those that are fighting on the ground all the way forward. And so I agree, it's a reassessment of threat. We also, the forms of contact that our doctrine utilizes, the commander's intent is make first contact with something that's not a human. How do you leverage an artificial intelligence tool to provide more rapid analysis of where the threat is, how they are assessing you? Therefore, what do you need to push forward that is a robot, something that flies through the air and is controlled by a human at significant range to reduce its threat, but can help you answer those priority information requirements before you start committing a human forward? Not just to extend the network and communicate, but to put your fires capabilities in position to sense and strike, and then your maneuver forces in a position to accomplish that overall task.
So, understanding all of that, it feels like the commander is being torn in multiple directions, right? I mean, it's a really vibrant, dynamic space. And listen, I get it that those who served in the Cold War, the greatest generation, World War II, they also had a dynamic space. I'm not trying to do a disservice to them, right? But it feels like the commander is being pulled in a huge number of directions. And our historic training was for the commander, he knew when we set up C2 at the divisional level, at the corps level, that he wouldn't necessarily have the best picture at his headquarters. And therefore, he would disappear off to the front line with his forward HQ and try and get a feeling for what the fight was like, and then go back to his main and would endlessly do this shuffle. Is that something we're going to start to see again, where whilst he centralized all this stuff, how does he get that feedback from the FLOT, from the SPOD, for the logistics, for the engineers, for the MI team? How does he pull that stuff together in a contested environment? It's a difficult role for the commander, right?
That's a great question and a phenomenal point. I saw it helping a division commander when I was a Division G3 in the 3rd Infantry Division, as a joint crisis planner and executor in a couple of the operations you mentioned, Operation Octave Quartz, and then Allies Refuge, and then definitely as a Brigade Combat Team commander in training while deployed, and multiple exercises at both combat training centers in the United States. The question that commanders wrestle with is their placement. Being comfortable changing it based on the demands of their unit and demands of the environment. Many, as you mentioned, want to be where the action is, but need to be where the information is. And that may not be the same place at the same time, especially when we are operating in a contested environment, an adversary that is absolutely hunting not just command nodes, but the commander. And so the maneuvering of the network, the prescriptive use of the different enclaves also enables the commander to visualize. Army doctrine describes them as the commander's tasks and responsibilities. The understand, visualize, describe, direct, lead, and assess inside of the operational process. The commander has to go where the staff needs them, but also provides the directive guidance to enable parallel planning and directive execution of subordinates. And that changes over time. The commander is the best staff officer in the organization. That's what got them selected to be the commander in the future. And so there's guidance, there's directive, there's being a participant and a driver, not an observer of the planning process. That is their responsibility as well. But the presence, the inspirational responsibility of a commander is also not easily shirked or sloughed off, because they do need to be forward, communicating, inspiring, getting their own assessment of what is in the operational environment. And that can't be done oftentimes over a JChat, over satellite communications, or even a VTC at times. And so it's terrible. You have to pick the least worst option, and it changes over time.
And that must have implications for the deputy, for the chief of staff, for the rest of the staff entirely, right? Because we know the commander's being hunted. We only need to look at the success of the Ukrainians going after individual commanders, Russian commanders, over time, that actually there's almost an expectation that the number one is going to get knocked out. The number two will have the ability to step up and not just execute the plan, but to take over. Something that we train our NCOs to do, but I'm not sure we've done it in HQs for quite some time, have we?
Drives the importance of clear, understandable, and actionable commander's intent, but also redundancy in command posts and placing or prioritizing where we place our protection assets as well. hitting multiple nails on the head with the hammer of how the nature of war is remaining the same, but there are characteristics that are absolutely changing the way commanders command and control. Their responsibilities have not changed. War is still what it has been. How it is being executed is absolutely evolving. And that's part of what we're wrestling with at our combat training centers, taking those lessons from forward, how we are training at home, and then teaching the students and the faculty of where I am right now to incorporate the evolving environment, those new innovative tools into instruction for those organizational leaders that are here with us at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and the Command General Staff College. And so you're helping highlight what we have to do, not just with the operational force as we are preparing to fight, we are deterring and assuring in how we're postured, but also how we're training and educating our leaders as they move through professional military education and training in our joint force.
And in that role, right, and this sort of brings the whole thing together. What are you changing in there? Because I'm often poked in the shoulder and the chest by academics who are going, listen, we have millennia of experience of war. We have great lessons that have, thousands of years. Are we really saying that we throw all that away just because our iPhone has arrived and we're used to having real-time chat, or there's OSINT or whatever it is? And there is this balance, right? It must be difficult to have that balance between the millennia of history of lessons, whether it's the US Civil War or operations in Africa or Chinese military thinking or Russian operational art or their histories of Clausewitz. And how do you mesh that against the modernity of war, the digitization of C2, the dominance of the network and information? How do you now balance that in the university?
I love the question, and this is an ongoing conversation. And I love that you brought in Clausewitz. I've got visions of the Trinity up on a slide or on a dry erase board next to me. As a student of warfighting for a quarter century here. There's a great book written by Dr. Peter Schifferle from our School of Advanced Military Studies. It's called America's School for War. And it talks about the interwar period and the leaders that were developed here at Fort Leavenworth between 1918 and the execution of World War II. That we cannot forget the core purpose of training organizational leadership to fight better. The C in Command and General Staff College is about command. And so the people that we are training here are helping commanders think faster and apply the tenets of warfighting in a different environment. So you cannot forget the lessons of history. But we must, and we are currently doing, because we've been charged with continuous transformation. There's modernization at echelon inside our Army with the Transformation Training Command, the Combined Arms Command here at Fort Leavenworth. But the sense of urgency to take the tools and the observations of what's happening in the environment around us and apply them here. A couple examples. In our classrooms, not just the Command and General Staff School with majors, but in SAMS, in our School for Command Prep, how we are training our civilians and our relationship with our senior non-commissioned officers. We are incorporating artificial intelligence by teaching prompt engineering, not just to write better papers and get a better grade. We've got very prescriptive, permissive policies, so we still are creating authentic assessments, but we are teaching organizational leaders to be operational artists and use tools that are already out there, to experiment with a persona to provide rapid analysis of higher headquarters orders, of existing doctrine, to help us identify risks in issued planning documents and where more coordination is required in the form of a control measure or with an adjacent unit. Based on the allocated fires resources from the Army or from the Air Force or other services, where are we not going to achieve the directed correlation of forces to allow us to be successful? Those are things artificial intelligence must help us do faster. And we're using those in our classrooms right now. Data literacy. We are injecting large amounts of data and forcing the students to determine how it is helpful to inform planning and decisions for a commander. We are taking the latest doctrine from our former training and doctrine command, now transformation training command, that looks into the future, focused on the U.S. Indo-Pacific, and using that enemy, those capabilities, and applying those to develop a battlefield framework, describe the conditions, and wield the elements of operational art, knowing what environment we're going to fight in. You have to baseline yourself on the analog without these tools, but then rapidly use them in the second, the third, and the fourth iterations of the planning exercise. We run a school for application. It's not pontificating and thinking about things that might be in the future. It is understand what warfighting has always been about and incorporate, innovate with the latest tools. And it's uncomfortable. I am migrating to the digital world and what is required of the next fight. The first 20 years of my career were not in this space, but our faculty is doing the same thing. Foundationally understanding what our nation and the world has gone through to get us to here, but respecting the new tools and forcing students to use them at times, experimenting with themselves before instructing and incorporating into the lesson in hours and days of preparation. So we are innovatively adjusting our curriculum at the pace and scale of what we're seeing in training and the operational force.
I mean, it must feel like when you're going through that, starting with a map and compass, suddenly then having an AI helper with you, and then having that ripped away again to simulate the contestation in the EM environment, and having to go back to the map and compass and start the exercise, not again, but in train. I mean, it's a very, very dynamic thing to achieve, right? But it probably reflects the realism of everything that we're seeing in the sort of grand trends of combat right now.
Absolutely correct. We are charged here, and I'll use the Command and General Staff School as an example, to take a captain or newly promoted major, an 03 or an 04, who has demonstrated superior competency at tactical level warfighting and get them ready to fight at the organizational, so higher tactical, low operational level. So a division and a corps commander has an agent of change who operates on their staff like an apex predator, competent and confident, prepared to help the commander think and do thinking for the commander. They've been exposed to the collaborative tools such as One Brief that our corps and our divisions are using right now across unclass, class, and higher, that they are using AI tools, systems of record such as Vantage, but aware of the Maven smart system suites. So they have been exposed, they have experimented and built some competency into helping those divisions and corps better fight. So it is an uncomfortable space. It is, you've got to understand, I'm going to use slide rule, but I promised all listeners we don't still use slide rules. But the map and compass, that analogy that builds the baseline competency, the fundamentals of warfighting, that's the price of admission. But we are going to graduate those that have a master's level degree and understanding of warfighting at the varsity level, the divisions and the corps. We are reducing the startup cost of the chiefs of staff and the divisions, and the recipients of that investment that's happening here are going to be the brigade and below. That's our intent.
So I'm reaching for a book now because I read this great book recently, Expectation of Valor, Kevin Benson, who did Planning for the Iraq War. And one of the things that came across in that was the demand back in 03 for speed, right, in responses, in everything. And it comes across in all your answers, everything we talked about. Speed has been right there. I mean, it's sort of implicit in everything that there will be better as well. But it feels like speed is the one thing that most leaders feel will be the determinant of the victor, right? And I wonder how true you think that is. I mean, there's a lot to be said for patience over speed. But I was struck by Kevin Benson's book about the demands for speed in responses, in planning, in amendments, in innovation, in everything. It was about speed. And everything that we read about MDO, about network connectivity, about formalizing fighting doctrines, that speed lies really at the heart of it. How do you balance that speed with better? How do you balance with the creativity that maybe some of the European faculties would say is at the heart of learning about the art in war rather than the science of it in terms of networks and speeds and everything else?
I love the question because speed and tempo are not synonyms, because commanders talk in terms of tempo and then generate the demand for speed in planning and analysis. And I think that's the space for tools to help close the gap in the expectation where commanders want an answer. They want data informed assessments to help them think and fight, to close the gap between the art that they are responsible for and leveraging the science that these tools and planners are going to help them bring together. Ethan Diven's opinion: we will not replace the need for a human commander to apply their judgment to the speed of analysis provided by a tool or artificial intelligence. Where the future warfare is going is the ability to leverage a tool to help us do rapid data infusement, compare elements or drive elements of operational art to speed analysis so you can come up with multiple options that can be weighted appropriately faster. And when a commander wants to change the weight of a particular criteria, if they trust the cadoy of their gut, because they've been there before, they can inject that back to a planner. And it doesn't mean we're crumpling up 30 pages of prose and all the PowerPoint slides and the analog and digital graphics that the staff has stayed up all night creating. It is a simple adjustment of the prompt, rapidly spit out. Organizational leaders on staff apply their judgment and they can make recommendation to that commander in minutes or hours and not days. This is all about opportunity. It's going to be uncomfortable as we step into this era of opportunity, but our leaders are rightfully charging us to make sure we have a sense of urgency to be uncomfortable, to do it not just better, but how can we do it faster and you get more outcomes that are ultimately better and generate options. But that element of operational art that all commanders want to hear is risk. Where is there risk? There's risk in the prompts that we use to do this. There's risk in not having all of the information that we potentially applied to the large language model. There's risk in 3 of the operational planning teams used artificial intelligence tools or personas to get to the outcome. And 1 might not have as sexy a product developed, but it was all humans, all conducting their own thought and analysis. And it may not look as cool, and it may not be as far as the process, but how does that compare to the other 3 tool-enhanced options? Tons of opportunity. It is exciting, but also uncomfortable. So our job is to be positively disruptive and intrusive as we teach people how to do this better. It is great. We are at echelon breaking things, but also making sure we don't forget the core reason for our existence and our purpose, why we were built in the first place.
So one of the issues is that you only own part of professional military education in the US Army, right? How do you achieve any sense of coherence with the other parts?
Great question. We are currently the Army University, but we have been charged with transforming and strengthening a relationship with the Army War College for enterprise level tasks. We have been predominantly focusing at training at the tactical and operational levels of war, where they focus at strategic for sure. There is a directed bridging and connection that we are modernizing and really excited about what the futures can provide, the way that they educate and their focus, and then the way that we have. The future is incredibly bright and is going to be really, really powerful.
Ethan, we've run out of time and I could go on talking to you for another hour, but I don't think anyone's cardio exercise would hold us to it. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. Really refreshing to have someone in your position with such array of experiences behind you, hearing about what you think about command is going to look and feel like for the future, and with such enthusiasm. Thank you so much for sharing your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved the dialogue and excited to respond to any feedback or questions from the listeners. It's a very dynamic group. I love it.
I'll let you know. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 17 NATO nations.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, do hit the like or subscribe buttons. It really helps us reach a wider audience. The show is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a production for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.